Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Roudny, and I've been asked to talk to you about my experience with the Cold War, specifically with communism in Czechoslovakia. Thank you for having me in your class. I guess the first question you might be asking yourselves is, why are they telling us all this? That is a perfectly valid question. How do events from decades ago have any relevance on your life today in America in 2017? I'm going to leave that answer until right at the end of my video. And I'm also going to prepare you for something. Even though you are all quite young, I'm not going to sugarcoat my message for you. You'll hear some horrible things about how the communist regime treated the Czech people. I'm not telling you those things for shock value or to glorify violence or to indoctrinate you with my opinion. I'm telling you those things because you and I are a free people and we deserve to hear and speak the truth. I was going to start my talk with a list of all the great Czech writers, artists, music composers, and innovators to give you an idea of what the Czech people have contributed to the world. But then I thought about it, and instead, I want you to know how it feels to be there in the Czech Republic, if I can. I'm a Canadian now, and my allegiance will always be to the country that gave me a free and prosperous life. But I've been back to the Czech Republic, and I can see why it's so hard to leave. There's a place there that Czechs call Český ráj. It's translated Czech paradise. And they're not kidding. It's a kind of national park. Long, gorgeous hiking trails that give beautiful views of the landscape and some of the most picturesque yet challenging rock climbing in Europe. My father was and is an avid rock climber. He and his friends would go to Český ráj often. A rock climbing club was where my parents met, as a matter of fact. Český ráj is just one example of the great beauty and culture of the Czech Republic. Prague is one of the most interesting and picturesque cities in the world. The Jizerské Mountains in the north of the country are just a fantastic example of the beauty of nature and a great place to rent a cottage for the summer. And the food, good golly. I'm surprised the Czechs don't have the world's leading heart surgeons, because the sheer amount of fried cheese consumed in this country is amazing. Every Czech ethnic restaurant has arguably the three greatest meals ever devised by man. Vepřoknedlo zelo, which is a ham steak served with sauerkraut and sliced bread dumplings. Svíčková, which is a beef roast served with, yes, you guessed it, bread dumplings and a thick vegetable puree and cream sauce. I get hungry just talking about it. And of course the aforementioned fried cheese. Would you like fries with your fried cheese? Of course you would. Czechs are also responsible for the greatest beer on planet Earth. And as a country, Czechs consume the most beer per person in the world. Once you reach the appropriate age, I strongly recommend saving your nickels and dimes and taking a tour of the brewery at Pilsen. This beer is what everyone is talking about when they say Pilsner Lager. So, there are lots of reasons to like the Czech Republic. At this point, we should go back a bit into Czech history. Czechoslovakia earned its independent statehood after World War I. The Czechs were for decades under the oppression of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The battles that the Czech people fought for their independence are too broad a subject for this talk. But after World War I, we became our own country. And for nearly 3 decades, that worked pretty well for the Czechs. But then a certain fellow named Hitler came along. You may have heard of him. The French and English made a pact with Czechoslovakia to assist the Czechs with air support against the Nazis. But despite their promises, when the time came, the West decided to appease Hitler by giving him Czechoslovakia and never delivered the air support the Czechs needed to defend themselves. Without the support of the English and French Air Force, the war against Hitler would have been nothing more than a slaughter, so the Czechs surrendered. The time the Czechs spent under Nazi oppression was brutal. One German officer, Reinhard Heydrich, known as the Butcher of Prague for his merciless killing of Czechs and Jews during the Nazi occupation, said it was remarkable that no matter how much he tortured the Czech people, they would only laugh at him. He called the Czechs the laughing beasts. After World War II, the Czechs had been liberated from German occupation, but their liberators were not the blessing the Czech people deserved. America, England, and the Soviet Union all had a hand in liberating Czechoslovakia from the Nazis, but the Russians were the ones who got a foothold in Czech politics. By 1946, the leader of the government and many ministers were communists. In 1948, the remaining non-communist ministers resigned, hoping that it would force new elections. Instead, the Communist Party took over control of the government. Czechoslovakia would not have another free election for almost half a century. The communist government ruled Czechoslovakia with a combination of guilt and fear. Their slogans and propaganda were designed to make the average person feel patriotic by cooperating with the regime and guilty of handing the country over to capitalists if they didn't cooperate. They accomplished this by censoring and editing all public discourse. Newspapers, television, radio, all were controlled by the government. Even people's personal mail was opened and read to find signs of any anti-communist thought. The people that were smart enough to see through the propaganda were harassed and intimidated into silence by the police force, often put in prison or even murdered for opposing the regime. Jan Masaryk, who was the last non-communist member of the Czech government in 1948, he was a popular radio personality and a vocal opponent of communism, was thrown from the window of his apartment by Russian KGB agents because he disagreed with the direction the government was heading. The government then spread the story that he had committed suicide due to problems in his marriage. By that time, people knew you couldn't speak out freely against the communists anymore, so they had to be clever to get their point across. Czech writers wrote about Masaryk's murder by saying, "Masaryk was a very tidy man. So tidy, in fact, that after he jumped from his window, he closed it behind him." Gallows humor at its best. Fast forward to 1968, when the people of Czechoslovakia would see another example of communist brutality. In the mid to late 1960s, the political climate of Czechoslovakia had opened up somewhat. Czech media and people were given a more liberal approach by their government when it came to enforcement of communist rules. It seemed that the country would finally be able to progress away from oppression and towards a free, democratic society. People began demonstrations calling for free elections. But the government in Moscow, the center of the communist regime in Europe, saw that as a threat to their power, and after some just-for-show negotiations in Moscow didn't silence the protests, they sent in the armed forces of the USSR. The Czech protesters in Prague were unarmed, and in order to try to defeat their Russian invaders, they used clever and peaceful tactics. They removed all street signs in Prague and other cities so that Russians couldn't navigate using maps. They used crowd blockades to hide street entrances and landmarks so that the Russian tanks ended up in small alleyways and dead-end streets. Czechs even engaged in conversations with Russian soldiers in an attempt to let them know that all they wanted was freedom and peace, but the soldiers had been told otherwise. Their government was telling them that the Czechs had to be liberated from capitalists trying to steal their country. When simply intimidating the Czech people into submission didn't work, they used violence to silence the protests. Russian tank crews, frustrated by the human blockades, simply started driving over the people in their way. Some of the tank drivers, seeing what they had done, climbed out of their tanks, drew their guns, and committed suicide immediately. People in free countries around the world protested the invasion. Canada made several calls for a UN resolution to denounce the invasion and send in a liberating military force, but that never happened. At the Ice Hockey World Championships in Sweden in 1969, the Swedish fans and Czech fans now living in the West brought signs aimed at the Russian team. The sign said, "Your tanks can't help you now." Because the Czechs offered very little physical resistance, the casualty rate of the invasion was fairly low. But the toll on the progress towards freedom was devastating. Czechoslovakia was forced back into censorship and oppression. Thousands of Czech people fled the country in 1968. Jan Palach, a Czech student, set himself on fire in protest in the main square of Prague. You can see then why my parents were deeply concerned about the society they lived in, especially when their 3-year-old son came home from school one day and said he had learned all about how helpful and great the Russian communists were. The school system was telling their children that the Russian oppressors who had killed their people were in fact their savior. My parents couldn't stand to live that kind of forced hypocrisy, so they decided to leave. But simply leaving a communist regime isn't as easy as packing your bags and buying a plane ticket. Under communism, travel was strictly regulated. You had to have special permission to leave the country, and even then, you could only go to a neighboring socialist republic. Another thing you need to understand is that people who left communist Czechoslovakia to live somewhere else were considered criminals. If a person was caught trying to cross the border illegally, they could be sent to prison or shot. If you've studied what happened at the Berlin Wall, you'll know that soldiers posted on the East German side would shoot anyone trying to escape to the west. This was also true in Czechoslovakia. So, it was very risky to attempt defection. Defection is what it's called when you try to leave a communist country and live somewhere else. As if that wasn't enough, the risks didn't end with just the people trying to defect. It was almost certain that after defection, the police would interrogate the families of the defectors. This happened to my grandmother. The police came to her apartment and questioned her for over 3 hours about what she knew of our defection. Often, the government would punish those families by taking away their houses or other possessions. Sometimes, because of this, family members who knew that someone in their family was about to defect would tell the police about it to stop it from happening. It was a horrible situation where family members sometimes had stronger ties to their government than to each other. To save our family from this anguish, my parents chose not to tell any of their family they were leaving. As I get older and realize what it means to have children, and how important that is to the rest of my family, I can't imagine what my parents went through when they decided to take their son away from his grandparents forever, and not tell them face to face it was going to happen. That's the kind of decision anyone leaving an oppressive regime has to make. When you decide to leave a place like that, you are doing so knowing you will never see anyone you love again. You can imagine it is incredibly difficult, but that's how desperate they were to live in a free society. The process of actually leaving the country was also hard. We planned to defect with my uncle and his family because we knew that if one family defected, the other one would never be allowed to leave the country. We had to apply twice for permission to travel to Yugoslavia. My parents had to apply for permission to buy foreign money. My uncle had to bribe a government official to get on a sightseeing tour, and later had to make up a story about visiting friends in a small town in Yugoslavia so that he could get his passports from the trip's police escort. In order to hide all the documents we needed, like birth certificates and my father's university diploma, my parents used a clever trick. They took one of my books and sliced open one of the thick cardboard pages, put the documents inside, and carefully glued the page back together. It worked, but for the whole trip, they were watching me very carefully whenever I read that book. Finally, we made it to Yugoslavia, but the plan was already falling apart. We had sent some camping gear by mail ahead of time so that we wouldn't have to all stay in the same room with my uncle, which would look quite suspicious to the police. But the gear was stolen before we could pick it up. Then, attempting to get a travel visa to another country was a long process. My dad tried 4 different consulates without any breakthrough. It looked like we would have to go back to Czechoslovakia. But then the first of several lucky breaks happened for us. A nice lady at the Swiss consulate told us about a generous officer at the French consulate who had been giving Czech refugees French travel visas. She said if we got the French visas, we could have a Swiss visa that allowed us to travel in and out of Switzerland, but only once. She kept her promise, and we crossed into Switzerland the next day. The cheapest hotel near the train station seemed like a good choice, until the elevator doors opened to the hotel's bar. The half-naked woman dancing on a piano and other barely dressed ladies were quite surprised to see a family with a 3-year-old boy walk out of the elevator. We had found the friendliest brothel in Switzerland. The plan, however, was not to go to France. My uncle wanted to live in Germany, and we were determined to get to Canada. We made it through Switzerland to the German border, where we told the German border guards about our plan. And they didn't like it very much. They said my uncle could stay, but that we had to go back to Switzerland and apply for permission to travel to Canada from there instead of from Germany. The guards angrily threw our bags back into the police van and drove us to the Swiss border, sirens blazing. Remember that we only had permission to go through Switzerland once, and now we were being brought back there a second time. It looked very much like we would be sent back to Czechoslovakia, where we would certainly go to jail for trying to defect. But again, we got lucky. The Swiss border guard was a nice old man, and he spoke about 20 or 30 words of English. Unfortunately, not the same 30 words my dad knew. But with hand signals and broken English, they worked out a deal that allowed us to stay in Switzerland and apply for immigration to Canada. He even bought me a sandwich and a lemonade just as our train was pulling away. After that, things went quite well. The Canadian Immigration Office processed our application faster than expected, and we were accepted to Canada. We had left Czechoslovakia in August 1979 and arrived in Canada in mid-October of the same year. The trip had taken nearly 3 months. After all that we had been through, being accepted in Canada was a relief. My parents could finally start building a normal life. But even after making it out, the struggle was not over. It began to sink in that truly we had left everyone behind. Long-distance phone calls in the early 80s were not what they are now. It was very expensive and sometimes difficult to hear the other person. So in order to stay in touch, we recorded and sent cassette tapes to each other. And I still remember sitting down with my parents to record those tapes so that our family back home could hear our voices. I know it hurt my parents, knowing that they had left all of their family behind. Finally, in 1989, almost 10 years since we left Czechoslovakia, our old country won its freedom from communism. The defectors from the old regime were welcomed back and all previous convictions were lifted. But of course, the time lost, the lives ruined, the families split apart can never be taken back. In the end, we're happy we moved to Canada. Still today, the opportunities and the way of life a person can enjoy in Canada are better than that in the Czech Republic. Despite the fact that my old home is a beautiful place. But you never really get over a thing like that. Our defection, though it was the right decision, was something that changed our lives forever. So, at the beginning of this talk, I said I was going to answer a question for you. Why are they telling us all this? And here's my answer. You are blessed to be one of the few people in the world who live in a free country. Millions of people would trade places with you in a heartbeat if they could. With that kind of privilege comes responsibility. Soon, you'll be making choices about how you want to live and what direction you want your country to go. You'll be confronted by different opinions, different viewpoints, and you'll have to make up your mind which one of them you support and which one you reject. We want you to be equipped and ready for that time, not only with your own feelings and gut instinct, but also with the lessons of history. How did other people before you handle these questions? What did they learn from their experiences? What would they have done differently if they could? Those are the things we want to teach you. From time to time, a politician or another kind of community leader may come along and claim to have the solution for living in a perfect society. And that person may be so convinced of his idea that they want everyone to agree with them, even if it means that no one can speak their mind. Sometimes it may even look easier to go along with that than to keep doing the hard work of being a free person. In those times, I want you to remember this. Freedom isn't just something that grows out of the ground in one place and not in another. Freedom to say and think what you want without retaliation or oppression is all there is in a free society. And it only exists inside each person. Laws have no meaning when people don't believe in them. People's rights have no meaning when others won't protect them. Freedom is in your mind. If you stop believing in it and you stop working for it, it can be gone faster than you would think. And as I hope I've shown you, the price a country pays when it gives in to oppression is very high. So, I want to thank you for listening to this talk, and I look forward to hearing your questions if you have any. Thanks very much. Bye.